So today what I'm going to talk about is this idea of partisan dehumanization. And so for those of you who've taken my classes or have seen any of my talks, it won't be surprising that I'll be talking about polarization. But I'm going to take it a step further in a way that we haven't really talked about before. And so there's a couple things that got me thinking about this. One is some more recent comments by our president that's gotten some traction in the media. And then another is some research I came across by some psychologists about this idea of dehumanization and some of the consequences of it. And so when we put these things together, partisanship, polarization, dehumanization, kind of helping us explain about where we are now. So we start with what happened in the last week, where at a press conference, Donald Trump was talking about the MS-13 gang, referred to them as animals. It gets picked up in the news and reported that it sounded like he called all immigrants animals, which at some point he has done. But he doubles down on the rhetoric when he tweets, of course, the fake news reported this wrong. I said it this way, and it's absolutely true, and I would say it again. He then goes to a rally in Nashville the next day where he is talking about the MS-13 loving Nancy Pelosi and says, they're not human beings, they're not human beings. And this is why we call the bloodthirsty MS-13 gang members exactly the name I used last week. Now, we know that this president doubles down on all of his rhetoric, so it's not surprising. But what it got me thinking about a little bit is, what are the consequences of talking about others as less than human? And we've had a long history of this, and I'll talk about this a little bit, but how can understanding this process of dehumanization help us understand why in American politics we are so far apart from one another? Okay? So we know that since the mid-1990s in particular, polarization has increased rapidly, and we know in particular since 2008, the way that we feel about our opposing partisans has changed. It's not just that we don't agree with them. It's that we fundamentally question their ability to understand the world. We think that if they control the government, the well-being of the nation is at stake. And this is a newer phenomenon, right? So what I've been asking myself over the past week is, how do we get from here, which is troubling enough as it is, that we are fearful of the well-being of the nation if opposing partisans are in control of government, to here, where there's a man who puts on Facebook that he thinks our president is inhuman and then goes and shoots members of Congress when they're practicing for a softball game. How do we get from there to here? Now, I am not suggesting in any way that those who use that language are going to go out and shoot people. In fact, sociologists and psychologists say that the link between dehumanizing rhetoric and thoughts and violence is spotty at best. So I don't want to suggest that this is true. But I think we should think about consequences of using this rhetoric and how it could get us to a place that even resembles close to this. It's an important thing to think about. This takes us to this idea of dehumanization. And I'm going to start talking about this concept. And we've seen it, even if you couldn't kind of put your finger on what it was called. We see it all the time. Some of us maybe have been a party to the language of dehumanization. And then I'll get back to talking about it in terms of partisanship. So we in America have a very long history of dehumanizing others, some in very, very overt ways, some in incredibly troubling ways, when this cartoon that was in a newspaper is showing President Obama as not human being shot and saying, we'll have to find someone else to write the next stimulus bill. So taking it to a place where, and we know that there are, I should say this, that obviously when we talk about certain kinds of dehumanization, particularly with African Americans, so much of this is wrapped up in race and a long history of this. And so that's, that's a 3-hour talk in and of itself. But we have more recent examples. I know we talked about this in most of our classes. And of course, overt racial tones here, but also the idea of taking an other and making them less human, and what does that do to the way that we think about their value, not just their value in a democratic society, but their value as actual human beings. We've seen examples of Jews as rats, okay, during the times in the 1940s and, 40s and 50s, and even before and after that. We've seen Halloween costumes. This is an actual Halloween costume that you can purchase, not making this up. Right? These are very overt ways, even if we're not realizing it, that we are reducing others to something less than human. And we see it in more subtle ways. Just the rhetoric we use when we talk about women, right? Chicks and bunnies and cow and mare and everyone's favorite female dog, right? Just those words alone reduces women to something less than human. Now, what that does, for those of you that saw my talk in the fall or have, I don't know, had any conversations with me ever, is that it cuts women's political power at the knees. Same thing happens to any group that is othered and dehumanized in this way. This takes us to a study that was done by some researchers in 2015 from Northwestern, MIT, and Harvard. And what they wanted to understand was this idea of blatant dehumanization. So not these kind of latent tendencies, but how could we actually measure if white Americans in particular, Americans in particular, if when looking at others, if they could measure how evolved they think these groups are. So basically what they showed, or what they tried to do here, and I'll show it in a second, is they have this ascent of man scale, which takes this really inaccurate evolutionary picture of, like, you know, the ape to the person, right? And ask these Americans to rate how evolved they are on a scale from 0 to 100. And what we see here, now, and also what's interesting, what the researchers say is that nobody ever really got scored at 100. So there's that, I suppose. But the idea that we see as we move from, like, white to not, we see people as less evolved. Now, while we may not think this is surprising, it's the consequences of knowing this now, what I've said to my students, and it came back at me yesterday: when you see something, you can't unsee it, right? So a couple things. What the researchers tell us is that when we dehumanize another person or group, our empathy turns off. We know how important empathy is, and we know that when we dehumanize others, that empathy turns off. What are the consequences of not having empathy for others? We know what those are. It also predicts aggressive attitudes, right? I'll talk a little bit more about this as we move along. And then the one that I'll spend the most time talking about and kind of wrap it back around is this idea of social dominance orientation. We also talk about this as, like, cultural preservation, that a dominant group needs to preserve itself as the dominant group, and so is supportive of not having equality or equal opportunity or equal law protection for other. This is really, really, really troublesome, but also some of us may say, yeah, but we see this all the time. This isn't surprising. Yeah, but now we actually have some data to suggest that we know that this is true. So you may ask yourself, what do we do? How do we fix it, right? We always want to solve the problem. Well, over and over, all the experts who have studied dehumanization say the answer is get to know people who are different from us. Go have coffee with someone you don't know. Move into a neighborhood with someone you don't know. Just get to know someone. And we actually know that this does help. This works. Now, when we transition to talking about dehumanization in terms of partisanship, it gets a little dicier. And I'll get back to this in a little bit about getting to know your neighbor that's not like you. So let's talk about this a little bit. This is the scale that, and I hope I say his last name correctly, Kateli et al., the scale that they showed on their study that I just had referenced before. And of course, they're asking, you know, how evolved are they on the scale? So what I've said to my students a lot is, you know, we find a methodology we like, we just do the same one, but we do it in another context. So we have two political scientists now who are working on a paper where they are taking this and they're looking at it with the parties. So the exact same methodology, the exact same scale, and asking the members of the party, how do you feel about Democrats or Republicans? What they find is that 77% of the respondents say that the other party is less evolved. And between Republicans and Democrats, there's not really a difference. So no one party is more or less likely to say the other party's less evolved. Where this gets really interesting is what they do as a second part of their study is sort of a quasi-experiment where they provide a fake news story to the respondents where there was this big fight at a 4th of July picnic and people were injured and they had to, like, run for safety. And some people were told that Democrats were the ones at the party, some were told Republicans were the ones at the party, and some were told nothing. And Democrats were 8 percentage points more likely to agree with the statement that says the people involved are like animals. Republicans were 12% more likely to say that when it was Democrats. So not only is there an endorsement of the language of less evolved, there is also looking at the other party and saying, yeah, you're animals. And I'm more likely to say you're an animal if it's someone of the other party who's engaging in this behavior. So now what do we do if we know that we are looking at the other side as less than, not only less than us, but less than human? Then how do we bridge this divide? What do we do? Well, remember, what we were told to do is to get to know people. So the answer then, if we put it onto this context, is if you're a Democrat, get to know a Republican. If you're a Republican, get to know a Democrat. Well, how do we do that? When you ask people what they think about people of the other party, they're saying, well, they're saying they're not as human, which we just found out, but even on they're saying they're less intelligent, dishonest, lazy, immoral, closed-minded. So you're already coming in hot, right? When you meet somebody of the other party. So how are you going to get to know somebody if your guard is up? We also don't want to live where they live. There is a type of partisan segregation. Part of that is, as Professor Kavanaugh told us, because of gerrymandering. Part of that is because of economic inequality that we've talked about, rural and urban America, right? We know that's true. But also, even within certain areas, we know that Democrats and Republicans, they don't really want to live by each other. So how do you get to know the other side, to humanize them and turn the empathy back on, if you're not willing to even live where they live or have a conversation with them? This is really troubling when we think about how to bridge the partisan divide in America. But I think it does help us understand why we are so far apart from each other. Because as I've said a lot, you know, politics is very emotional. It's hard to measure that, but I think we're getting a little bit closer to measuring that. Oh, sorry, I forgot to flip the slide. Living in communities with one another. There was also, students brought to my attention that Dr. Mark had talked about this study that said that, like, Democrats don't want to marry Republicans and vice versa, right? So don't even want to have a relationship with them. So the underlying theme of the talks, I feel like we should have had a theme of democracy, because everything we're talking about kind of takes us back to this idea of what are the consequences for democracy. And there's a couple of things I think are important as we try to figure this out a little bit. And it's this chain I thought of in my head today. We know what dehumanization is now. We know how we can measure it. We know what the effects of it are. We also know that dehumanization causes social order dominance. We know that this is true, okay? We also know that from that social order dominance, we know that people who feel this way favor inequality among groups in society. The dominant group wants to stay dominant and then will favor using the government to make sure they stay dominant. We've seen it in everything we've talked about so far today. We see it every day. From here, what political scientists have been studying very recently is that those, particularly white Americans, who feel like the government is now giving favor to the other, is okay with letting go of parts of democracy and accepting authoritarianism because it protects them. So if we are okay with dehumanizing, in fact, we practice it and we see it practiced by the politicians to each other and talking about the public, if this is something that's part of our culture now in some ways, then what it takes us to is, it's okay when we have an authoritarian leader. Not for everyone, not if you're the other, but if you're the dominant group. And what ends up happening is we continue to see it as a cycle. So the question is, if we really value the core principles of democracy, if we value legitimate opposition, right, something Dr. Muck and I have been talking about a lot lately, if we really value that as a core tenet of democracy, which our founding fathers did, and we're at a place now where we don't care about legitimate opposition because the opposition is an animal, then how do we figure out how to save our democracy? Thank you.